Hello, this is a quick and dirty presentation on the genre of the Renaissance Mass cycle, or Cyclic Mass. So if you will recall in your presentations that you went through and the texts that you read for medieval chant, specifically within the Western Christian Church, I provided this slide that described contexts for chant. And the two primary contexts were the office, the divine office or canonical hours, and also the Mass. And the Mass is the reenactment of the Last Supper and celebrated daily in monasteries and convents, became a celebration weekly for the public by the Renaissance. So on this slide it says more on this later in our music and spirituality topic, and that later is now. So how is the Cyclic Mass associated with the concept of the Western Christian Mass? Well, it sets liturgical texts from the Mass ordinary. Now, there are two sets of liturgical texts associated with the Mass. So there are the proper texts and the ordinary texts. So the proper texts are going to be prayers and readings that are associated with events and celebrations in the church calendar, whereas ordinary texts are incorporated no matter where the congregation is in relation to the church calendar. So they are repeated church texts. You can think of this as they're ordinary, right? They're everyday. They happen all the time. Whereas proper, right, is special and only incorporated on feast days and celebrations. So the Mass cycle, the genre, the musical genre of the Mass, actually sets texts of the Mass ordinary. Now, both the proper and the ordinary are liturgical, so that's another word you learned in your medieval chant presentation, meaning that these are texts that celebrate the rites and play a role during a church service. So you can have all liturgical texts are sacred, but not all sacred texts are liturgical, meaning you can have sacred texts that do not function as part of a church service. And that can be thought of broadly across multiple religions. Okay, so back to our Mass ordinary, which will be at the heart of the Mass cycle, our genre, right? So the Mass is a service that is very important in Western Christian churches or Roman Catholicism. However, the Mass cycle is a very specific musical celebration or musical setting of texts for the Mass and the Mass ordinary in particular. So the Mass ordinary has 5 primary, and you can see it on this as well, right? So these are proper texts, prayers, and then these that will change depending on the church calendar. And these are ordinary, so they happen all the time. And the ordinary texts are the Kyrie, the Gloria, the Credo, the Sanctus, and the Agnus Dei. So what composers did, or ecclesiastical figures towards the end of the Middle Ages into the early Renaissance, began to think, hey, we could musically link some of these prayers together. And then eventually they would set all 5 of these together. So the genre of the Cyclic Mass, this is our official definition. What makes the Cyclic Mass the genre that it is that it sets Mass ordinary texts in which the different sections, Kyrie, Gloria, Credo, Sanctus, Agnus Dei, are unified musically. And this musical link includes the number of voices. So all of the voices will be the same for each of these sections, right? 4 voices in the Kyrie singing, 4 voices in the Gloria, etc. The same modal center. So we are regarding melody and harmony in relation to modal organization or modal patterns. So there will be modal connections, so the same finals. So say you have a final on D on the Kyrie, you might have that on the Gloria and the Credo as well. And then similar musical motives that are usually linked to borrowed materials. Cyclic masses are also generally polyphonic. So the Cyclic Mass is also referred to as the polyphonic Mass cycle because of the predominance of polyphonic textures. It doesn't mean that you might not hear an opening monophonic chant related to that specific movement or section, or homophony, especially towards the end of the Renaissance, but it is primarily a celebration of texts in the Mass Ordinary that that would have been performed polyphonically as organum in the earlier Middle Ages. And also a quick note about Mass. Mass as a musical genre is not capitalized, but if you're talking about the service, it is. The more you know, right? Okay, so composing the Mass Ordinary. It's very interesting because as we begin to unify musically these 5 sections of the Mass Ordinary into the genre of the Cyclic Mass, we also begin to have composers being regularly associated with those musical works. So this is kind of the advent of associating a musician and a composer with specific works. This is something, it is a trend of the end of the Middle Ages into the early Renaissance. So before the 1430s in the Middle Ages, what we get is we have basically separate pieces. The Kyrie is a polyphonic work that isn't really necessarily musically linked to something like the Gloria within the same Mass, capital M. Chant was still used as the foundation. However, beginning in the Renaissance, specifically toward the about 1430s-ish, composers began to link ecclesiastical figures, because they are servicemen as well, or clergymen, excuse me, is that they begin to link these together, and chant is not always at the foundation. It sometimes is, but we'll learn about how what is at the musical heart of a Mass cycle in the Renaissance moving forward. Okay, so the Mass types, there are 3 different Mass types. So there's the Cantus Firmus Mass, the Imitation Mass, and the Paraphrase Mass. There are actually more than this, but for our intents and purposes, I think it's good to know the difference between these 3. So Cantus Firmus Mass means that there's going to be a fixed voice in the tenor, right, the one that held out the chant in organum. This fixed voice is going to be borrowing from a monophonic or polyphonic genre, and initially it's monophonic chant. An imitation Mass is where the movements are going to be linked to a polyphonic genre, and all of the voices from an initial polyphonic genre, their melodic lines in the 4 voices, are going to be borrowed in all 4 voices of the Mass. This is different than the third one, the Paraphrase Mass, where you have each movement based on the same monophonic melody, and that is paraphrased in all voices. So that's different than the Cantus Firmus Mass, because the Cantus Firmus Mass takes a monophonic line, either from a monophonic genre or a polyphonic genre, right? So one line from a polyphonic genre or just the monophonic melody, and only places it in the tenor voice. A Paraphrase Mass will take a monophonic melody and place it in all of the voices in the Mass. All right, I'm going to continue forward. So you have a table that you are filling out, and this, I think, succinctly summarizes what I just said in terms of borrowed material, where in terms of the voices is the borrowed material, and how is it used. So in a Paraphrase Mass, that monophonic melody might be used in whole, or it might be changed slightly in terms of the melody. Whereas a Cantus Firmus really is using the original chant melody and using it usually in longer notes, which pays homage to the genre of organum, another polyphonic genre. Okay, I really want this to be under 15 minutes for you. There is a 4-voice Mass texture. So everything is in reference to the tenor, right? Because that's that initial voice that is holding out the chant in organum, and this tradition continues in the polyphonic genre of the Cyclic Mass. So what we have is the contratenor bassus, right, which is relatively low to the tenor. We also have the contratenor altus, which is relatively high to the tenor, and we have the superius or discantus, which is very high to the tenor, right? It's the highest above the tenor with no overlap. The contratenors, both bassus and altus, actually overlap with the tenor voice in terms of the range. And you can see from these, the Latin, right, where we get our alto, tenor, bass, and soprano. This is where it kind of begins. The story begins. Okay. Last two things I want to highlight are where. So yes, there are monasteries and convents and a shift specifically to cathedrals and universities, right? But where geographically are these cyclic masses being composed? So in the 15th century, right, there are earlier cyclic masses. These are being composed in Burgundy for the Duke of Burgundy, which had nearly the same influence as the King of France during the 1400s. Burgundy was actually allied with England during the Hundred Years' War, which is happening during the 1400s as we have these cyclic masses being composed. And thus we hear interesting influences from both England, north, and France and northern Italy in our what was called the Burgundian school or Franco-Flemish composers. It's also known as the international style. It's more pan-national and pan-European, specifically to Europe. But what we get as a result of the Hundred Years' War are shared musical characteristics in these cyclic masses from multiple countries, mainly England, France, and Italy. This happens as a result of the Hundred Years' War, but also as a result of the culture of who and where this is being performed. So whereas our organum, right, is developed in cathedrals and universities, the 12th century to the 14th century, oral tradition to one that is written down. Our 15th century cyclic masses are going to be composed for court chapels, right, which is an interesting marriage between the sacred and the secular. So working for secular kings and queens and royalty, right, within our feudal society. However, there is a strong presence of religion, right, still within that society. And the court chapels is where specifically this sacred and liturgical music would have been performed. So musicians composed for religious services, sacred, and court entertainment, secular. Now, you are going to listen to, and we will do this together in class next week, but we are going to listen to an example of an earlier cyclic mass from the 15th century by Guillaume Dufay. And we will juxtapose this to a 16th century cyclic mass, since this genre continues into the 1500s. However, the shift chronologically also happens geographically. And of course, we're speaking in terms of we were right here, right, and influenced from Belgium, England, parts of France, and then northern Italy. But the shift really happens. We have a lot of our cyclic masses being composed in Rome for Italy. So Italy is going to be our cyclic mass hub, if you will, by the 1500s. And this shouldn't be a surprise, right? We've already explored Italy in relation to the Renaissance in secular music via the madrigals, right? Our composer is Spanish, and this speaks to how Spain was actually ruling Italy by this composer's time period. So Spain is actually ruling over, or Habsburg Spain, the Habsburg dynasty is ruling over the different parts of Italy, specifically the southern half. And our composer, Tomás Luis de Victoria, and his mass, even though he is Spanish, he is composing this for Rome and in Italy. So we have a Spanish-Italian connection in our music by Victoria. So I'm hoping in our listening for next week, we will be able to compare and hear a kinship in terms of the genre overall, but also stylistic differences in relation to time period, as well as the geographic influences on both Dufay and then Victoria. So with 1 minute left, let's review what this presentation included. Cyclic masses are performed as part of Western Christian masses. They set the text of the Mass ordinary, not the proper, and there are 5 movements or sections to the Mass order, or Mass ordinary. They are united musically, and that's what makes it a cyclic Mass. There are 3 primary Mass types listed there, and there are initially 4 voices in Masses, although later, especially by Victoria's time, which is the same time as Giovanni da Palestrina, Luigi da Palestrina, there are sometimes 6 voices. 15th century masses flourished in Burgundy and France, and 16th century masses flourished in Italy. If you have any questions, let me know. I hope you had a fun time taking notes, and we will have an even funner time. Yeah, I said funner. More fun time listening to these cyclic masses.